Every car argument you've ever heard eventually comes down to two numbers: horsepower and torque. Someone pulls up the spec sheet, points at the numbers, and declares victory. Bro, it makes 450 horsepower. Yeah, but mine has 500 pound-feet of torque. And then everyone argues for 45 minutes, and nobody changes their mind because nobody actually knows what either number means. Horsepower and torque are the two most quoted, most compared, and most misunderstood numbers in the entire car world. People tattoo horsepower numbers on their arms. They put torque figures in their Instagram bios. They use these numbers to settle arguments that can't be settled by numbers alone. And the vast majority of them, including some people who've been into cars for years, couldn't explain the actual difference if you put a gun to their heads. Here's the thing: horsepower and torque aren't two separate, competing forces inside your engine. They're mathematically related. They come from the same place. They describe the same engine doing the same work, but they describe it in different ways, and understanding that difference changes how you think about every car you'll ever drive, build, or argue about on the internet. Let's break it down from zero. No assumptions, no skipping ahead. By the end of this, you'll understand both numbers, how they relate, why one isn't better than the other, and what actually determines whether a car is fast. Let's go. We're starting with torque, because torque comes first, not in importance, in physics. Torque is the foundation. Horsepower is built on top of it. Torque is a twisting force. That's it. It's how hard something rotates. If you grab a wrench and push on it to tighten a bolt, you're applying torque. The harder you push and the longer the wrench, the more torque you generate. Torque is measured in pound-feet in the US, which literally means the force in pounds applied at a distance of 1 foot from the center of rotation. In an engine, torque is the twisting force that the crankshaft produces. Here's how it's generated. Fuel and air ignite inside a cylinder. The explosion pushes a piston down. That piston is connected to a connecting rod, and that connecting rod is attached to the crankshaft at an offset point. As the piston pushes down, it turns the crankshaft, the same way your foot pushing down on a bicycle pedal turns the crank. That rotational force, that twist, is torque. The amount of torque an engine produces depends on several things: how much air and fuel are in the cylinder, more mixture equals a bigger explosion; the compression ratio, how much the mixture is squeezed before ignition; the stroke length of the piston, longer stroke means more leverage on the crankshaft; and the efficiency of the combustion process. Bigger explosions and longer lever arms make more torque. Think of torque like this. Imagine you need to open a stuck jar lid. Torque is the twisting force you apply to the lid. More torque means more twisting power. If you can't open the jar, you need more torque, either by gripping harder, using a rubber grip for more friction, or getting someone with bigger hands. The jar doesn't care how fast you twist. It cares how hard you twist. That's torque, pure rotational force, independent of speed. In a car, torque is what you feel when the engine pulls. That shove in your seat when you accelerate from a stop. That grunt when you're towing a trailer up a hill. That immediate physical sensation of force pushing the car forward. High torque at low RPM is what makes a diesel truck feel like it could drag a building off its foundation. The engine might not spin fast, but each rotation is enormously powerful. Now horsepower, and this is where most people get confused, because horsepower isn't a separate force, it's a calculation. Horsepower is torque multiplied by speed. Let me say that again because it's the single most important sentence in this entire script. Horsepower equals torque multiplied by RPM divided by 5,252. That's the formula. That's the mathematical relationship. Horsepower doesn't exist independently of torque. It's derived from torque. Torque is the raw twisting force. Horsepower is how fast you're applying that twisting force. The unit was invented by James Watt in the late 1700s. He was trying to sell steam engines to replace horses in mines and factories, and he needed a way to tell customers how many horses his engine could replace. He calculated that an average horse could move 33,000 pounds a distance of 1 foot in 1 minute. That became the definition of 1 horsepower, 33,000 foot-pounds of work per minute. It was a marketing term, essentially. James Watt invented a unit of measurement to sell steam engines, and we're still using it 250 years later. Back to the formula. Horsepower equals torque times RPM, 5,252. That 5,252 is a constant that makes the units work out. But the important part is the relationship. Horsepower is the product of torque and engine speed. This means two things that most people miss. First, an engine with modest torque can still make a lot of horsepower if it revs high enough. A naturally aspirated four-cylinder that makes 150 pound-feet of torque at 8,000 RPM produces roughly 228 horsepower at that RPM. It doesn't twist very hard on any individual rotation, but it's rotating so fast that the total work output per minute is significant. This is the philosophy behind high-revving Japanese sport engines, the Honda S2000, the old Integra Type R, modern track-focused motorcycles. Not a lot of torque per revolution, but so many revolutions per second that the power output is enormous. Second, an engine with massive torque at low RPM can make impressive power numbers without ever spinning fast. A big diesel truck engine might make 800 pound-feet of torque at 800 RPM. Plug that into the formula. 800 times St152 equals roughly 274 horsepower. That's not a crazy horsepower number. But 800 pound-feet at 1800 RPM means this engine can drag 40,000 pounds up a mountain in top gear without breaking a sweat. It doesn't need to rev. It just muscles through everything by twisting incredibly hard at low speed. Here's the analogy that locks it in. Go back to the stuck jar lid. Torque is how hard you twist. Horsepower is how many jars you can open per minute. A person with huge hands and enormous grip strength has a lot of torque. They twist hard and the lid comes right off. But maybe they're slow. They open 10 jars a minute. Another person has average grip strength, less torque per twist, but they're lightning fast with their hands. They open 20 jars a minute. The second person is doing more total work per minute, even though each individual twist is weaker. That's the horsepower difference. Same work, different delivery methods. The big hands person is the diesel truck. The fast hands person is the sport bike. Both are doing real work, just differently. Here's a fact that'll make you sound smart at any car meet. On a dyno chart, the horsepower and torque curves always cross at exactly 5,252 RPM. Always. Every engine, no exceptions. Why? Because of the formula. HP equals torque times RPM 5,252. When RPM equals 5,252, the formula simplifies to HP equals torque. At that exact engine speed, the horsepower number and the torque number are identical. Below 5,252 RPM, the torque number is higher than the horsepower number. Above 5,252 RPM, the horsepower number is higher than the torque number. This isn't some magical engine characteristic, it's just math. But it shows up on every single dyno chart, and once you know to look for it, you'll see it everywhere. It's also a useful sanity check. If someone shows you a dyno chart where the curves don't cross at 5,252, either the chart is in different units, like Newton meters instead of pound-feet, or it's fake. This is where we leave the spec sheet behind because the spec sheet is lying to you. Not technically lying, just telling you an incomplete truth that might as well be a lie. When a manufacturer says an engine makes 300 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque, those are peak numbers, the single highest point on each curve, at one specific RPM, under specific test conditions. The engine makes 300 horsepower at, say, 6,400 RPM. It makes 280 pound-feet at 4,200 RPM. Those numbers are real, but they tell you almost nothing about what the engine feels like to actually drive. What matters is the shape of the curves. How much torque does it make at 2,000 RPM when you're cruising and need to pass someone? How broad is the power band, the RPM range where the engine is making most of its power? Does the torque come on early and hold steady, or does it spike at 1 RPM and fall off everywhere else? Is the horsepower curve a gentle hill or a sharp peak? Two engines can both claim 300 horsepower and feel completely different to drive. Engine A makes a flat 260 pound-feet of torque from 2000 RPM all the way to 5500 RPM. The power delivery is smooth, linear, and available everywhere. It feels strong at any speed, in any gear. Engine B makes 200 pound-feet at 2000 RPM, then nothing much until 5000 RPM, where it spikes to 300 pound-feet and peaks at 300 horsepower right at redline before falling off a cliff. Engine B is technically a 300 horsepower engine, but for 80% of the driving you actually do, cruising, passing, merging, accelerating from a roll, it feels weak. The power is all crammed into the top of the rev range. You have to wring it out to get anything. The spec sheet says both engines make 300 horsepower. The dyno chart tells you they're completely different experiences. This is why people who actually understand performance talk about power bands, torque curves, and area under the curve, not just peak numbers. A peak number is a snapshot. A dyno chart is the whole movie. Here's the thing that makes the whole horsepower versus torque debate even more complicated. By the time the engine's output reaches the wheels, it's been transformed by gearing, and gearing changes everything. Your engine produces torque at the crankshaft. That torque goes through the transmission, which has multiple gear ratios. Each gear multiplies the torque by a different amount while changing the speed proportionally. A low gear, like first gear, has a high numerical ratio, maybe 3.511, meaning the crankshaft turns 3.5 times for every one turn of the transmission output shaft. That multiplies the torque by 3.5, but reduces the speed by the same factor. A high gear, like sixth gear, might have a ratio of 0.8001, which barely multiplies torque, but allows much higher road speed. After the transmission, the torque passes through the differential, which has its own ratio, typically somewhere between 2.51 and 4.51, depending on the vehicle. That further multiplies the torque before it reaches the wheels. So the torque at the wheels, which is what actually accelerates the car, is the engine's torque multiplied by the transmission gear ratio, multiplied by the differential ratio. A car with 200 pound-feet of engine torque in first gear with a 3.51 transmission ratio and a 3.73.73.73 ratio is putting roughly 200-611 feet of torque to the axle. That's over 13 times the engine's torque output. Gearing is a force multiplier, and it's the reason a 150 horsepower economy car can still chirp its tires in first gear. This is where the torque debate falls apart for a lot of people. An engine with lower peak torque, but a transmission with shorter gear ratios can put more torque to the wheels than an engine with higher peak torque and taller gearing. The engine's torque number on the spec sheet doesn't account for gearing. It's the raw output at the crankshaft before any multiplication. It's like comparing two people carrying boxes upstairs. Person A can carry 50-pound boxes. Person B can carry 30-pound boxes, but Person B has a dolly that triples their effective capacity. Person B is moving 90 pounds per trip. The raw strength number is misleading because the equipment, the gearing, changes the effective output. This is why a Corvette with 460 pound-feet of torque might lose a drag race to a car with less peak torque but shorter gearing and less weight. The number on the spec sheet doesn't tell you what arrives at the wheels. And what arrives at the wheels doesn't tell you how fast the car accelerates unless you also know the vehicle's weight. Speaking of weight, if there's one number that car arguments should focus on but almost never do, it's weight. Acceleration is force divided by mass. Newton's second law. The force pushing the car forward divided by how much the car weighs determines how fast it accelerates. You can make all the power in the world, but if the car weighs 6,000 pounds, a lot of that power is just moving mass, not building speed. This is why power-to-weight ratio is the single best predictor of how fast a car feels. Not peak horsepower, not peak torque. The ratio of power to weight. A 200 horsepower car that weighs 2,400 pounds will feel dramatically faster than a 300 horsepower car that weighs 4,800 pounds. The lighter car has a better power-to-weight ratio despite having 100 fewer horsepower. The Mazda Miata is the classic example. It makes modest power, usually somewhere in the 180 to 200 horsepower range depending on the generation. The torque numbers are equally modest. On a spec sheet it looks slow, but the car weighs around 2,300 to 2,400 pounds. That power-to-weight ratio, combined with its gearing, its balance, and its lightweight chassis, makes it feel far more engaging and quicker than the numbers suggest. Meanwhile, a full-size luxury sedan making 350 horsepower might feel sluggish because it weighs 4,500 pounds. More power, worse ratio, slower experience. The jar analogy. One more time. Torque is how hard you twist. Horsepower is how many jars per minute. But power-to-weight ratio is how big the jars are. If you're opening tiny jars, you don't need as much force or speed. If you're opening massive jars, you need everything you can get. The car's weight is the size of the jar. Okay, with all of that context, let's answer the actual question. What makes a car fast? If fast means straight-line acceleration, 0 to 60 quarter-mile highway pulls, the answer is power-to-weight ratio combined with traction and gearing. You need enough power to overcome the car's weight, enough traction to put that power to the ground without spinning the tires, and gearing that keeps the engine in its power band during the acceleration run. For straight-line acceleration, horsepower is the more useful number because it accounts for both torque and RPM. A high-horsepower car with good gearing will generally be faster in a straight line than a high-torque, low RPM car because the horsepower number already factors in how fast that torque is being applied. Torque alone doesn't tell you how fast the engine is spinning, which matters for acceleration. But if fast means responsive and punchy in everyday driving, merging, passing, pulling out of intersections, torque at low to mid RPM matters more. You're not revving to 7,000 RPM to pass a truck on the highway. You're at 2,500 RPM in fourth gear, and you need immediate shove. An engine that makes 350 TEBDEF at 2,000 RPM will feel way more responsive in that scenario than one that makes 350 lbf at 6,000 RPM, even if the second engine has more peak horsepower. If fast means lap times on a track where you're braking, turning, accelerating, braking, turning, then it's everything. Power-to-weight ratio, torque curve shape, gearing, aerodynamic drag, tire grip, braking performance, suspension setup, weight distribution, and driver skill. Peak numbers on a spec sheet are almost irrelevant. A well-sorted 280 horsepower car with perfect balance and great tires will lap faster than a sloppy 500 horsepower car with bad suspension and too much weight. The point is this: fast isn't one thing, and no single number on a spec sheet captures it. Horsepower and torque are useful pieces of the puzzle, but they're not the puzzle itself. Everything we've talked about so far assumes a naturally aspirated engine, one that breathes on its own without help. When you add a turbocharger or supercharger, the torque curve changes dramatically, and with it, the entire character of the car. A naturally aspirated engine's torque curve is typically a smooth, gradual hill. It builds gradually from idle, peaks somewhere in the mid-range, and tapers off as the engine approaches redline. The curve is predictable and linear. What you feel at 3,000 RPM is a logical progression from what you felt at 2,000 RPM. No surprises. A turbocharged engine's torque curve is different. Modern turbocharged engines are often tuned to produce peak torque very early, sometimes as low as 1,500 to 2,000 RPM, and hold it flat across a wide plateau. This is called a torque plateau, and it's become the dominant power delivery strategy in modern turbocharged cars. A 2.0-liter turbo four-cylinder might make 270 lb-ft of torque from 1,800 RPM all the way to 4,500 RPM. That's a massive flat band of constant torque that makes the car feel responsive and strong across almost the entire usable rev range. This is why modern turbo cars often feel faster than their peak numbers suggest. The torque isn't concentrated at 1 RPM. It's spread across thousands of RPM, creating an engine that feels punchy almost everywhere. You don't have to rev the engine to find the power. The power is already there, waiting, at nearly any RPM you're likely to use in daily driving. But here's the wrinkle. That flat torque plateau means the horsepower curve is essentially just climbing throughout the rev range, because torque stays constant while RPM increases. Horsepower equals torque times RPM, 5,252. So if torque is flat and RPM is rising, horsepower rises in a straight line. The peak horsepower number usually comes right at the top of the plateau, just before the turbo runs out of breath and both curves start falling off. Supercharged engines are similar but tend to have an even more linear relationship because the supercharger delivers boost proportionally to RPM rather than waiting for exhaust pressure to build. The torque curve on a supercharged engine often looks like a gentle slope that rises steadily, peaks in the mid-range and holds relatively well. No sudden spikes, no valleys, just steady, predictable force. Naturally aspirated engines, especially high-revving ones, often have torque curves that are more peaky and less flat. They make their best torque in a narrower window, which means you have to work the gearbox to stay in the sweet spot. You have to manage the power band with gear selection, which creates a more interactive driving experience. But it also means there are RPM ranges where the engine feels underwhelming. This is the fundamental trade-off between turbocharged and naturally aspirated engines, and it's not really about peak numbers at all. It's about curve shape. A turbo engine with a broad, flat torque curve and 280 pound-feet will feel stronger in daily driving than a naturally aspirated engine with a peaky 300 pound-feet number that only shows up in a narrow RPM window. The turbo engine's peak number is lower, but its usable power, the area under the curve, is actually greater across the driving range most people use. One more variable that rarely gets discussed in the horsepower versus torque debate: traction. Because all the power in the world means nothing if you can't put it to the ground. When you accelerate, the tires are the only thing connecting all that engine force to the road. If the force at the wheels exceeds the grip the tires can provide, the tires spin. Wheel spin looks dramatic and sounds cool, but it's wasted energy. Every revolution the tire makes while spinning is a revolution that isn't accelerating the car. You're converting power into tire smoke and noise instead of forward motion. This is why all-wheel drive cars often launch faster than rear-wheel drive cars with the same power, even though AWD systems add weight and parasitic loss. More driven wheels means more total contact patch, which means more grip, which means more of the engine's power actually reaches the road as acceleration instead of wheel spin. It's also why tires are arguably the single most important performance component on any car. A 400 horsepower car on cheap all-season tires will be slower in every measurable way, acceleration, braking, cornering, than the same car on proper performance tires. The engine makes the power. The tires use it. If the tires can't handle what the engine is putting out, you're leaving performance on the table. A car that makes 300 horsepower and puts every bit of it to the ground through great tires and good traction management will be faster in the real world than a car that makes 500 horsepower but spins the tires through first and second gear. The spec sheet doesn't know what tires you're running. The spec sheet doesn't know if it rained. The spec sheet just says 500 HP and lets you figure the rest out the hard way. This is a perfect case study for everything we've discussed. Diesel engines and gasoline engines feel fundamentally different to drive, and the reason is entirely about where the torque lives on the RPM curve. Diesel engines produce enormous torque at very low RPM. A turbodiesel truck engine might make peak torque at 1600 to 2000 RPM. That means the moment you press the accelerator, even gently, even from a standstill, the engine is already in its peak torque zone. The pull is immediate, massive, and effortless. It feels like the engine has infinite strength at any speed. Passing on the highway in a diesel truck requires almost no effort. You barely touch the pedal and the truck surges forward because you're already in the fat part of the torque curve. But diesel engines don't rev high. They typically redline at 4,000 to 5,000 RPM. Because horsepower is torque times RPM, the relatively low RPM ceiling limits the peak horsepower number. A diesel truck might make 800 pound-feet of torque, but only 300 to 400 horsepower. The horsepower number looks modest. But the driving experience is anything but modest at normal speeds. Gasoline sport engines are the opposite philosophy. A high-revving four-cylinder or V6 might make peak torque at 4,500 RPM and peak horsepower at 7,000 RPM or higher. At low RPM, where you spend most of your daily driving, the engine feels average. The torque is modest, nothing exciting. But when you downshift, rev it out, and hit the top of the power band, the engine comes alive. It screams. Power surges. It feels fast because you climbed into the RPM range where the horsepower lives. Neither approach is better. They're different tools for different jobs. The diesel philosophy is hit hard at low speed, everywhere, all the time. The gasoline sport engine philosophy is build to a crescendo, reward the driver for revving, deliver an experience. One is a sledgehammer, the other is a rapier. Both are effective, just in very different ways. Let's talk about electric motors for a minute because they break all the rules we just discussed. An electric motor produces peak torque at 0 RPM. From a dead stop, you get maximum twist. There's no power band to climb into. There's no waiting for the engine to build RPM. There's no turbo to spool. There's no transmission gear to drop into. You press the accelerator and every bit of available torque hits the wheels instantly. This is why electric cars feel absurdly fast off the line. A Tesla Model S Plaid makes over 1,000 horsepower and hits 60 miles per hour in under 2 seconds. Those numbers are wild, but the real magic is the instant torque. There's no delay, no lag, no build, just immediate, violent acceleration that pins you to the seat from the first millimeter of throttle input. Electric motors also don't need complex multi-gear transmissions. Most EVs use a single reduction gear because the motor's torque curve is so flat and broad that it doesn't need multiple ratios to stay in a power band. It's always in its power band. The simplicity is elegant. The trade-off? Electric motors can lose efficiency at very high RPMs, and the torque does taper off at higher speeds. So while an EV will destroy almost anything off the line, some high-horsepower ICE cars can catch up or pull ahead at higher speeds where their engines are in peak power territory and the EV's motor is losing efficiency. This is why drag strip results from a roll starting at 40 or 60 miles per hour instead of a standstill. Sometimes tell a different story than 0 to 60 numbers. But for street driving, for the kind of speed normal people experience on normal roads, the electric motor's instant torque makes everything else feel like it's thinking about it first. It's changed the definition of fast for an entire generation of drivers. People who've never cared about cars are getting into EVs and feeling genuine acceleration for the first time, and it's rewiring their expectations. When you've experienced zero lag, full torque from standstill acceleration, going back to an internal combustion engine, even a good one, feels like there's a delay, a pause, a negotiation between your foot and the engine's willingness to respond. The EV just goes. And that immediacy is addictive in a way that horsepower numbers alone can't capture. One last point that the horsepower versus torque crowd needs to hear. A dyno measures output. It doesn't measure experience. Two cars can have identical dyno sheets, same peak power, same peak torque, same curves, and feel completely different to drive. Throttle calibration, turbo sizing, transmission tuning, exhaust note, steering feel, chassis stiffness, seat position, all of these factors affect how fast a car feels, and none of them show up on the dyno. A car with aggressive throttle mapping will feel faster than one with lazy throttle response, even at identical power levels. A car with a loud, raw exhaust will feel faster than a whisper-quiet one because your brain interprets noise as speed. A car with a 6-speed manual that you're rowing through will feel more engaging than a smooth automatic with the same power, even though the auto might actually be quicker. Perception is a massive part of the speed experience. Spec sheets measure mechanical output. Your brain measures sensory input, and those two things don't always agree. This is why people fall in love with cars that aren't particularly powerful on paper. The Mazda Miata, the Toyota 86, the old Civic Si. These are cars that feel fast, feel engaging, and feel rewarding without needing 500 horsepower to do it. Because speed is a feeling, not just a number. Torque is a twisting force, how hard the engine rotates the crankshaft. Horsepower is torque multiplied by RPM, how fast that twisting force is being applied. They're not separate forces, they're mathematically linked. The spec sheet only gives you peak numbers, which tell you almost nothing about how the car actually drives. The dyno chart shows the full picture, where the power lives, how broad the band is, and how the engine delivers its output. Gearing multiplies torque before it reaches the wheels, which means engine torque alone doesn't determine wheel torque. Weight is the forgotten variable. Power-to-weight ratio is the best predictor of how fast a car feels. Diesels make torque low, gas engines make power high, and electric motors cheat by making everything instantly. No single number makes a car fast. It's the combination of power, weight, gearing, traction, and how the whole package is put together. Horsepower and torque are not enemies. They're not competing. They're two descriptions of the same engine doing the same work. Arguing about which one matters more is like arguing whether height or weight matters more for a basketball player. It depends on the position. It depends on the play style. It depends on everything else about the player. Next time someone pulls up a spec sheet and points at the horsepower number like it's a final score, ask them about the torque curve. Ask them about the power band. Ask them about the car's weight. Ask them about the gearing. Watch the confidence drain from their face as they realize the spec sheet doesn't tell the story they thought it did. Speed isn't a number. It's a system. Horsepower and torque are two pieces of that system. The rest, weight, gearing, traction, tuning, and how the whole car comes together is what actually determines whether a car is fast. If this video finally made horsepower and torque click for you, hit like. Drop your car's power-to-weight ratio in the comments. I want to see who's actually doing the math, and subscribe so you stop losing arguments to people who think peak horsepower is the only number that matters. It's not. It never was. Now you know why. Later.